This is not the version that the story told, but the version it has tried to hide.
True strength is forged through adversity. Scipio, who defeated the father of strategy Hannibal, is a perfect example of this. In order to save Rome from disaster, he had to fight the powerful Carthaginian army abroad. While at home, he also had to spar verbally with the members of the Senate. Because Scipio wanted to take the initiative and attack Carthage, but the senators, led by Fabius, disagreed. They advocated a more conservative approach to warfare in simple terms: to wear Hannibal down on the Italian peninsula, cut off his external supplies, and continuously exhaust his energy until Hannibal was left with no options and had to surrender to Rome. Both sides engaged in a heated debate over this issue. Fabius, who was the most respected member of the Senate at the time, expressed his own views. Fabius first explained that his opposition to Scipio's plan to attack Carthage was not out of jealousy for the young man's brilliant achievements, but rather for the overall good of Rome. First of all, it was not unprecedented for Rome to launch attacks against Carthage. Back during the First Punic War, when Rome sent troops to North Africa, they suffered a disastrous defeat, with countless Roman citizens losing their lives. So history has already shown us that this approach is not feasible. Moreover, who can guarantee that if Scipio leads troops to North Africa, Hannibal will definitely withdraw from Italy? Even if Hannibal really does return to defend North Africa, what will the outcome be then? He managed to hold his ground on the Italian peninsula for years, fighting us to the brink even without any supplies. If he actually returns to his own territory, do you really think Rome would still stand a chance? I agreed to let an unqualified kid like you lead the army for the sake of Rome, for the sake of Italy, not to help you satisfy your personal ambitions. Remember this: Rome does not need heroes. At this moment, Scipio could no longer hold back. He stepped into the center of the assembly and requested to speak. Scipio said, "Although I am young, that is not my only asset. I have already fought in countless battles, and everyone here has witnessed the results I've achieved. May I ask everyone present, who here can claim to be more capable than I am? Furthermore, Rome today is no longer what it was when Hannibal first invaded. Back then, Rome was beset on all sides, but after years of effort, Hannibal is the only enemy we have left. You've been wearing Hannibal down on our own soil, may I ask? What victories have you actually achieved? You sent 2 consuls and 4 legions to Calabria to fight Hannibal, yet you didn't even manage to lay a finger on him. And now you still have the nerve to discuss our chances of victory with me. 5 years ago I stood here as well, and not a single person objected to me going to Spain. To be honest, the difficulties I faced back then were far greater than what we're dealing with now. Both my father and uncle died on the battlefield, and the Spanish front suffered a devastating blow, but I single-handedly turned the situation around and soon dominated Spain. Does such an achievement still not earn your trust? What's more, I'm even stronger now, so why are you trying to stop me from marching on North Africa? Please trust me, everyone. From now on, it should be Rome that takes the offensive against Carthage. The battlefield should be in North Africa. The pain Hannibal inflicted on us in Italy, we Romans will return to him in North Africa." Scipio's speech ignited the crowd's emotions, and the atmosphere in the Senate chamber began to change. More and more people began to side with Scipio, and now the two opinions were evenly split. The older members all supported Fabius, while the younger ones were more in favor of Scipio. In the end, Scipio was assigned to serve in Sicily. The Senate agreed that if it was truly necessary, Scipio could launch a campaign in North Africa the following year. However, they did not provide him with troops or horses, only the funds needed to recruit 7,000 volunteers. By 205 BC, Sicily had already become a Roman province. Scipio set out early for his post in Sicily, and as soon as he arrived, he immediately began organizing his legion, because of his previous achievements in Spain, and the injustices he suffered in the Senate. People flocked to join the ranks of this 30-year-old general. There were originally 2 Roman legions stationed in Sicily that Scipio could use, but even so, the manpower was still far from sufficient. Rome did not allow him to use state funds to recruit soldiers. But at this moment, Scipio was the highest authority in Sicily, so he took advantage of this position to exploit loopholes. After the end of the First Punic War, many city-states in Sicily were designated as provinces by Rome. Although the residents here were exempt from military service, their land was confiscated by Rome and then rented back to them, so they had to pay rent to Rome. Scipio made a private decision to return all the land to these residents, so they no longer had to pay rent. The people of Sicily were deeply grateful. They covered their own expenses and volunteered to join Scipio's legion. In this way, Scipio recruited 0 soldiers and 0 sailors, and then he still needed to turn this motley crew into well-trained Roman soldiers. Next, all that was left was to wait for the following year to launch the attack on North Africa. The Roman general Scipio was a master at seizing every opportunity. While training his soldiers in Sicily, he was also gathering all kinds of intelligence. One day, Scipio suddenly received news that in Calabria, where Hannibal was stationed, there was a port city called Locri that wanted to betray Hannibal and return to Rome's embrace. Without a second thought, Scipio immediately led 3,000 soldiers straight to Locri. Of course, Hannibal also heard the news, but unfortunately, he wasn't as fast as Scipio, and by the time he arrived, it was already too late. As a result, Rome tightened the encirclement around Hannibal even further. Capturing Locri was originally a great achievement, but the Senate was not pleased, because Rome had a rule that commanders could not lead their armies outside of their assigned areas. Locri is on the Italian peninsula, while Scipio was in charge of Sicily. Therefore, the Senate prepared to send an investigative committee to question Scipio. Scipio was not afraid at all. He said that Consul Licinius, who was responsible for dealing with Hannibal, led 4 legions but made no progress, whereas I used only 3,000 men to drive Hannibal into a desperate situation. Please remember, this Carthaginian lion will never give any opportunity to mediocre Roman generals. The Senate felt that Scipio was absolutely right, so they had no choice but to drop the matter. The following year, in 204 BC, Scipio could hardly wait to lead 26,000 soldiers aboard 400 transport ships to North Africa. The Roman army landed near Utica, the second largest city of Carthage. The Carthaginians had been living comfortably for years, so when they saw the Roman army, they were truly shocked. After Scipio landed, all he received was bad news. He had previously reached out to the 2 kings of Numidia for cooperation, and now there were results. First of all, Syphax, the king of Numidia, not only did not ally himself with Scipio, but instead sided with Carthage. Carthage won over Syphax through a political marriage. The bride was the daughter of Gisco, who had previously been defeated by Scipio in Spain. Moreover, Gisco's daughter was originally the fiancée of Massinissa, the other Numidian king. As a result, Massinissa completely broke with Carthage and defected to Scipio with just 200 cavalrymen. Because the throne of Numidia had been seized by Syphax, Massinissa was now a king with only 200 cavalrymen to his name. Scipio was also at a loss for words over Massinissa's misfortune. Not only had he lost his kingdom, but even his fiancée had ended up with someone else. Nevertheless, Scipio happily became good friends with this king without a kingdom. This is where Scipio differed from Hannibal. Hannibal never consulted others when making decisions. He always fought alone, whereas Scipio was much better at making friends. Scipio was even better at making friends, using the strength of others for his own purposes. Because in the Battle of Zama, it was precisely the perfect cooperation between Scipio and Massinissa that completely defeated Hannibal. Before marching on Carthage, Scipio had boldly declared that he would repay all the harm Hannibal had inflicted on the Romans, right there in North Africa. However, in Scipio's first year in North Africa, his experience was completely different from Hannibal's. When Hannibal entered Italy in his first year, he was unstoppable, while Scipio's entire first year was rather mediocre in terms of military achievements. Fortunately, however, the Senate didn't have time to worry about how Scipio was doing, because that same year, Hannibal's subordinate Mago landed in northern Italy at Genoa, bringing 14,000 soldiers and supplies by sea. Rome dispatched 6 legions to intercept Mago. Although the 3 Roman generals leading the army were all quite mediocre, they still managed to defeat Mago. After being seriously wounded, Mago retreated back to Genoa and never dared to show himself again. Hannibal, who had long been stationed at the southernmost tip of Italy, was also in a state of resignation. He didn't let the Roman army get a single step closer, but he himself also didn't venture out at all. In the end, it was the North African front that broke this stalemate. The Carthaginians were completely stunned when they saw the massive Roman army land. It took them several months to organize themselves to confront Scipio's forces. Among them were the Carthaginian army of 33,000 mercenaries led by Gisco, as well as 60,000 Numidian soldiers under the command of Syphax. Carthage and Numidia had a total of 93,000 men, while Scipio had only 26,000. There was no chance of winning in a direct confrontation, so Scipio came up with a very devious plan. His target was to take out Syphax. This is the most unfortunate woman I have ever seen. She was already engaged, yet was forced to marry her fiancé's enemy. In the end, she finally returned to her fiancé's arms, but the wedding gift she received was a bottle of poison. All of this began because of the war between Rome and Carthage. In order to eliminate 60,000 Numidian soldiers, the Roman general Scipio pretended to seek peace with Carthage, hoping that the Numidian king Syphax would act as a mediator between Rome and Carthage. Of course, the king was more than willing, since he stood to gain nothing from this war. The only reason he sent troops to help Carthage was because his father-in-law, Hasdrubal, was the Carthaginian general in command, and Scipio's request greatly satisfied the king's vanity. As a result, Scipio's envoys began to frequently enter and leave the Numidian army's camp. What the king didn't know was that those entering and leaving his camp were not envoys at all, but Roman generals from noble families. Their attendants appeared to be dressed as slaves, but in reality, they were all battle-hardened officers and centurions. Scipio deliberately stalled the negotiations. Although both sides seemed to be in frequent contact, in reality, nothing was actually being discussed. In this way, every Roman commander became thoroughly familiar with even the number of mouse holes in the Numidian camp. Then Scipio suddenly told the king that the negotiations were off, leaving the king completely baffled. But he soon got his answer, because Scipio quickly organized a night raid. In this night raid, Numidia and Carthage lost a total of 30,000 soldiers, but they failed to learn their lesson. A few months later, Hasdrubal regained his strength and once again forced his Numidian son-in-law, the king, to go to war with him. Unfortunately, this time their defeat was even more disastrous. Scipio took the initiative by using his cavalry to seize the advantage, leaving the flanks of the Carthaginian and Numidian allied forces unprotected, and then commanded the Roman legions to encircle the enemy. Because the encirclement was not perfect, Hasdrubal managed to escape back to the Carthaginian capital, while King Syphax fled back to Numidia. Scipio had no intention of letting Syphax go. He led his troops in pursuit all the way to Numidia, where he captured the king. This was because Scipio wanted to help his friend Massinissa restore the Numidian kingdom. Restore the status of king of Numidia. After Massinissa returned to the palace, he saw his fiancée, who had already married the king. Perhaps it was because this woman was too beautiful, or perhaps out of vanity. Massinissa immediately held a wedding with the king's wife. When Scipio found out, he blamed his friend for lacking ambition. This woman was already Syphax's wife, and now she should be sent to Rome and sold as a slave. And yet you shamelessly married her. So Massinissa gave his new wife a letter and a bottle of poison. In the letter he wrote that this was to protect his beloved wife from becoming a slave. After reading it, his wife simply said, "I accept the wedding gift my husband has given me," and then drank the poison. To help his friend recover from the pain of losing his wife, Scipio publicly declared in front of all the soldiers that Massinissa was the true king of Numidia. From then on, Rome finally had its first ally in North Africa. And at this point, Carthage was thrown into complete chaos. On one hand, they sent envoys to express their willingness to negotiate peace with Scipio, while on the other, they urgently summoned Hannibal back to Carthage. The terms Scipio proposed for peace were not excessive. Mainly, he demanded that Carthage withdraw from Italy, give up its privileges in Spain, and recognize and respect the sovereignty of Massiniss's kingdom. Carthage also appeared to agree to all these conditions on the surface. Thus, a truce was established during the peace negotiations. Hannibal's subordinate, Mago, also received the order to return. He led his entire army from Genoa in northern Italy, beginning the journey back to North Africa, but he died on the ship before reaching home. Fortunately, the soldiers all made it back to Carthage safely. As for Hannibal, when he received the order to return, one can only imagine what he felt inside. He was 44 years old that year, and it had been 16 years since he began his invasion of Italy. Now Hannibal's eyes were filled with exhaustion, disappointment, and indifference. The initial passion and fire were long gone. Now, all Hannibal wanted was to return to Carthage, and have one final decisive battle with Scipio. You have probably never seen a general so ruthless after sharing hardships with his men for 16 years of campaigning. When he finally had the chance to return home, he heartlessly abandoned his own soldiers. This man was none other than Hannibal, hailed as the father of strategy. At that time, Hannibal's homeland, Carthage, was constantly at odds with the rising power of Rome. Finally, in 218 BC, Hannibal launched the famous Second Punic War. He led his army across the Alps into Italy, fighting on Roman soil for 16 years, and was almost undefeated. What's even more remarkable is that during those 16 years, Hannibal only received outside supplies twice. When he was in the Apulia region, he could rely on seizing local wheat to feed his soldiers. But later, Hannibal was driven to Calabria, at the southernmost tip of Italy, where the land was the most barren and resources were extremely scarce. Although there were wealthy port cities, control of the sea always remained in the hands of the Roman navy, so it was unlikely that Hannibal could receive supplies by sea. It's truly a mystery how they managed to survive all those years. Hannibal's soldiers came from Africa, Spain, and Gaul, and they were all mercenaries. So when Hannibal was short on supplies and couldn't pay them, it would have been understandable for the mercenaries to leave him. But, amazingly, not a single soldier deserted Hannibal. This shows that an outstanding general doesn't necessarily have to possess extraordinary talent. Perhaps it's more important to be able to build a long-term, mutually dependent relationship with one's soldiers. This is especially important when you are in a foreign land. When Hannibal was urgently recalled to Carthage to deal with Scipio, he decided to take only 15,000 elite soldiers back with him, leaving the rest behind, which caused panic among the remaining troops. Over the years they had committed countless atrocities on the Italian peninsula, and the Romans would surely seek revenge, so they begged Hannibal to take them along. However, Hannibal resolutely refused many of the soldiers, and some even clung tightly to the departing ships, unwilling to let go. Hannibal gave the order. Hannibal ordered the soldiers on the ship to raise their bows and arrows and shoot at those compatriots who wanted to follow him and leave. When Hannibal first arrived, he was a young man of 29. Now, he was a 44-year-old, one-eyed veteran. One can only wonder what feelings he had as he left the Italian peninsula. But the Romans were undoubtedly overjoyed. The senators all went to Fabius's house to celebrate Hannibal's departure. Fabius, the proponent of the War of Attrition, was also known as the Shield of Italy, helping Rome endure its most difficult times. Just 1 month after Hannibal withdrew from Italy, he passed away at the age of 72. Unfortunately, he did not live to see Rome's final victory. Hannibal truly deserved his reputation as a great general. He alone supported the entire nation. Scipio had already defeated Carthage into submission and was actively engaged in peace negotiations. But as soon as Carthage heard that Hannibal had returned home, they immediately became emboldened. Not only did they terminate the peace talks, but they also detained a Roman fleet and refused to return it, forcing Scipio to prepare for war once again. Hannibal was also actively preparing for battle. Just as Fabius had feared, after Hannibal returned to his homeland, his forces were fully replenished. By 202 BC, Hannibal's forces had grown to 46,000 men, including 40 cavalry and 80 war elephants. Over 2,000 years ago, this was undoubtedly a formidable army. However, Hannibal was still not satisfied, because the number of cavalry was too small, and their quality was even worse. In the past, Carthage's cavalry all came from Numidia, But now that Numidia had allied itself with Rome, Hannibal could only ask the deposed former Numidian king Syphax's son to lead all his remaining cavalrymen into battle. Syphax's son readily agreed to bring 2,000 cavalrymen to join the battle, but since he had been relentlessly pursued by Massinissa, it would still take some time before he could rendezvous with Hannibal. Similarly, Scipio also invited the current Numidian king, Massinissa, to join the fight. Massinissa said he would lead 6,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry to provide support. Even with these 10,000 reinforcements, Scipio's total fighting force would only reach 40,000. Moreover, Massinissa had not yet arrived. Both Hannibal and Scipio hoped to join up with their respective allies as soon as possible, so they both marched toward the same location, Zama. A battle that would determine the course of history. The Battle of Zama was about to begin. If we were to name the 5 greatest generals of the ancient Western world, Hannibal and Scipio would definitely be among them. Even if we were to list the 10 most outstanding commanders in Western history to date, the 2 of them would still be included. Moreover, these 2 engaged in a battle that determined the fate of the Mediterranean world, the famous Battle of Zama. When masters face off, the contest often begins long before they actually meet on the battlefield. First of all, their marching routes were quite unusual. The 2 armies were not advancing directly toward each other, but instead were both heading toward Numidian territory, as both sides wanted to join up with their Numidian allies as quickly as possible. As a result, the final battlefield was Zama, near Numidia. After Hannibal arrived at the town of Zama and learned that the enemy was only a few dozen kilometers away, he immediately sent 3 soldiers to scout the area. Unexpectedly, these 3 unlucky men were captured alive by the Roman army. Not only did Scipio not give them a hard time, he even warmly invited them to tour his camp, and, worried they might not understand what they were seeing, he carefully explained everything to them. The next day, the 3 also witnessed the Numidian reinforcements arriving at the Roman camp amid cheers. On the 3rd day, Scipio asked the 3 if they had understood everything they saw. They thought that understanding everything meant their time had come, but they still truthfully replied that they had seen everything they wanted to see. To their surprise, not only did Scipio not kill them, he even sent a team to escort them out safely. The 3 then reported their experiences over the past few days to Hannibal. After hearing this, Hannibal fell silent. He hadn't expected Scipio to be so magnanimous, and thought that this was someone he could work with. This person was able to come forward, so an envoy was sent to request a face-to-face meeting with Scipio. The 2 agreed to meet on a small hill, leaving their cavalry halfway up the slope, and only bringing their personal interpreters to the meeting. Hannibal was the first to speak, and his main point was to express his regret over the war. He first accused Rome of meddling in territories outside of Italy, and then blamed Carthage for stepping out of Africa, which led to the current situation. Hannibal also said that Scipio was young and talented, had fought bravely in Spain and Africa, and had never tasted defeat until now. But things are different now. I'm back. You know how formidable I am. I was once the master of Italy. I even reached the very gates of Rome itself. You could say that I, Hannibal, was the judge who decided Rome's fate. But I am not an arrogant man. We still have a future ahead of us, so let's try to do some good now. In the contest between you and me, even if you win, it won't change much. But if you lose, all your glorious achievements up to now will be wiped out, and you will be utterly disgraced. So I have a proposal. Let all the territories we have fought over, Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, and the rest belong to Rome. Then, let the Carthaginians swear an oath to the gods that they will never again resort to force in an attempt to reclaim these lands. I believe such terms will secure a bright future for Carthage, and will also bring you and all Romans great honor. After Hannibal finished speaking, it was now Scipio's turn to respond. He was 12 years younger than Hannibal. Scipio said, "It was Carthage, not Rome, that started this war. Now, the gods are helping the Romans step by step toward victory. So, it's clear who is right and who is wrong. I also know that we still have a future, and we shouldn't push things to the extreme. But if you had voluntarily withdrawn from Italy before I marched into North Africa, I would have given you a satisfactory answer. But unfortunately, leaving Italy was not your own intention. It was my victories in North Africa that forced you to withdraw. Under these circumstances, the terms of negotiation are bound to change. Don't forget the previous peace terms. The Senate had already agreed to them, but it was Carthage's lack of good faith that caused the talks to break down. So Hannibal, you'd better prepare well for tomorrow's battle, because the Carthaginians especially, you're really not suited to survive in times of peace." Seeing there was nothing more to say, Hannibal and Scipio both descended the hill and returned to their respective camps, preparing for the battle the next day. This battle would determine not only the fate of Carthage and Rome, but also the future of the Mediterranean world. It was a battle that would shape the destiny of the Mediterranean, and its brilliance is considered the pinnacle in Western history. The 2 sides were Rome and Carthage, and the formations deployed by both armies were beyond the imagination of mediocre generals. This battle was the ultimate display of tactics and strategy. The Battle of Zama, autumn of 202 BC. Gentle sunlight shone down on the plains of Zama. The overall commander of the Carthaginian forces was Hannibal, who had 46,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, totaling 50,000 men, as well as 80 war elephants. The Roman army was commanded by Scipio, whose forces consisted of 34,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, totaling 40,000 men. Hannibal was a master tactician renowned for his use of cavalry, but this battle was extremely unfavorable for him. First, he had very few cavalry, and second, they were all irregular troops. Originally, he could have had 2,000 Numidian cavalry reinforcements, but Hannibal agreed to engage Scipio before the reinforcements arrived. Even under such unfavorable circumstances, this peerless tactician still arranged an impeccable formation. Hannibal deployed 80 elephants at the very front of his lines, followed by a second row of 12,000 infantry, and a third row of 19,000 infantry. On each flank, he stationed 2,000 cavalry for defense, and then at a distance of 200. Then, 200 meters behind, he deployed the 15 personal guards he had brought back from Italy. The intention behind deploying the troops in this formation was very clear. First, the elephants would disrupt the enemy's formation, and then the second line of infantry would be sent in. These infantrymen were the weakest in combat strength and would soon be wiped out by the Roman legions. Next came the third line, which was stronger in combat. This line not only included mercenary groups from Macedonia, but also had cavalry protecting both flanks. However, the third line was also considered cannon fodder. Their role was simply to exhaust the main Roman forces. When the Roman heavy infantry had swung their swords until their arms were weary, Hannibal would then send in his own 15 elite personal guards, who were his strongest troops. As long as victory in this battle could be achieved, it was acceptable even if the soldiers in the first three lines were completely wiped out. If it had been the Roman generals Hannibal had faced before, this tactic would certainly have succeeded. Unfortunately, this time his opponent was Scipio. The Romans were best known for their use of infantry phalanxes, but Scipio was different and had learned from Hannibal how to use cavalry. In the Battle of Zama, Scipio employed a tactic that had never been tried before. When the Roman legions fought, they would usually place the light infantry at the front, followed by the heavy infantry. The heavy infantry was arranged from front to back in three columns: recruits, seasoned soldiers, and veterans. In addition, each of the three columns was further divided into small units, with each unit consisting of 60 to 120 men. The light infantry functioned more like guerrilla troops, so they did not fight in small units. However, in the Battle of Zama, Scipio also divided the light infantry into small units and positioned them in front of the gaps between the heavy infantry units. So from the front, it appeared as a continuous line. 3,000 cavalry were deployed on each flank of the formation. After the two commanders finished their pre-battle speeches, the Roman cavalry on both wings suddenly launched an attack. At Hannibal's command, 80 elephants, shrouded in billowing smoke, charged toward the Roman army. At this moment, something remarkable happened. The Roman light infantry units suddenly overlapped with the heavy infantry units, creating large gaps between the ranks. The charging elephants, not being foolish, chose to pass through the open corridors instead of crashing into people. Once the elephants had passed through, the Roman light infantry unleashed a barrage of javelins and arrows at them. In this way, Hannibal's elephant charge was easily neutralized by Scipio. Over 100 years earlier, Alexander had used the same tactic against the Persian elephant corps, the only difference being the species of elephants. The Persians used Indian elephants, while Hannibal used African elephants. Meanwhile, the infantry clash in the center of the battlefield also began. Hannibal's first two lines of infantry totaled 31 men, while the Romans had 28 infantry. In terms of numbers, Hannibal had the advantage, but when it came to combat effectiveness, the Roman army was superior. At this point, Carthage's cavalry on both flanks had already begun to retreat, leaving the infantry without cavalry protection and completely exposed. Scipio did not let this opportunity slip by. He immediately ordered the heavy infantry to launch an attack from the front and both flanks simultaneously, creating a trend toward a three-sided encirclement. This motley Carthaginian force was thrown into complete panic and tried to turn and flee, but behind them, Hannibal's 15 elite troops blocked their way. Hannibal had given strict orders. Any soldier who tried to escape was to be executed on the spot. So these mercenaries had no choice but to fight desperately, but they still could not defeat the Roman legions. The Spanish short swords introduced by Scipio proved extremely effective in the close quarters chaos of the melee. The blood of the Carthaginian mercenaries stained the grass red, and the piles of corpses even hindered the advance of the Roman army. Seeing that the moment had come, Hannibal ordered his 15,000 elite troops, who had been waiting in reserve at the rear, to launch their attack. When Scipio saw the enemy approaching from 200 meters away, he immediately ordered his entire army to change formation. This move was something Hannibal could never have anticipated, even in his wildest dreams. The Roman heavy infantry first moved the wounded to the rear.
Subscribe to Animystika not to miss anything. Like and share, and join me right away for a new trip in history.